While touring his kingdom at the close of the 8th century, Charlemagne found himself in the town of Apt, in the south of France. He was there during the dedication of the church. He had one of his notaries describe the remarkable events that day in a letter, which still exists, that he addressed to Pope St. Leo III. The church had been built on the site of an ancient chapel. Besides Charlemagne and his party, there was a huge crowd of noblemen. There were clergy, people, they're all present there for the rededication of the church. And this included a 14-year-old boy named John, who had been deaf, dumb, and blind since birth. He was the son of a local nobleman. During the ceremonies, John suddenly got up, walked up onto the altar with his walking stick, and began banging his stick over and over and over again on one of the steps of the altar. Obviously, whacking a step during the ceremonies caused quite a disturbance during such a solemn thing. So they tried to drag John off. As soon as they'd get him seated down, he'd come back up and keep whapping that same step and making signs that they should dig there. Well, Charlemagne pondered that. He was pretty amazed and impressed by the action of this young deaf, dumb, and blind man that kept going to the same place and doing the same thing over and over again. So much so that after Mass, he commanded that the step that John had been whacking be lifted up to see what might be beneath it. So workmen soon lifted up the altar step as well as the huge stones that lay immediately underneath it. And everyone's amazement, as they started moving these huge stones, they began to uncover a door. And where did the door lead? When they opened it up, there was an ancient stairway descending down before their eyes. Where did the stairway go? Down to the crypt of the ancient church in which Mass had been said centuries before during the times of the Roman persecutions. It led down into that underground church. When the door was opened, John, who by this time was hanging onto Charlemagne's hands, could barely be restrained. He started pulling Charlemagne forward as if he could see where he was going. In spite of the fact he's deaf, dumb, and blind, he's pulling him, and Charlemagne gave orders that the crowd should be held back, and then he allowed John to lead him down the stairs. John led Charlemagne down into the crypt, and then over to a wall, and he began whacking on that wall with his stick again, over and over again. So Charlemagne got the workmen there, and they pulled away that section of wall. And when they did, it uncovered a long, dark passageway. Here was this narrow passageway that had been hidden behind that wall. So John led Charlemagne and his companions down that passageway. And at the end of that passageway, they came to another crypt where there's a walled-in niche. And to their great astonishment, in front of this niche was a burning vigil lamp. Now think about that. You can imagine how astonished that is. You've just lifted up the altar step, removed all these stones, uncovered a door, gone down into it, taken out another wall, and then you get back there and here's a candle burning in the underground like that. A burning vigil lamp. You've had a deaf, dumb, and blind boy lead you to a buried door, to a buried crypt, through a wall, and back to this walled-in niche with the burning vigil lamp. And the whole crypt is filled with this unearthly heavenly glow. So they're standing there pondering all these things when all of a sudden the vigil lamp went out. At the very moment the lamp went out, John miraculously received his sight, his hearing, and the gift of speech. This boy that had been deaf, dumb, and blind since birth could suddenly see, he could hear and speak. And his very first words were, "It is she, it is she." Charlemagne didn't have the slightest notion what he was talking about, but he started repeating the words, and the people repeating them down the tunnel, and then all the way up above, and everybody fell to their knees. What was going on? Everyone's saying, "It is she," but who is she? The locals actually knew who she was. They knew that she was somewhere under the church. They knew that after the Roman persecutions, when the barbarians had begun to swarm over that region, she had been carefully hidden for safekeeping for many, many centuries. But they hadn't known where she was. Well, fine, Father, but who is she? Well, Charlemagne had the workers open up this little walled-in niche. And as soon as they began opening it, the air filled with this beautiful smell like an oriental incense. This sweet smell. And they could see laying there in the recess a wooden casket, a cypress casket was laying there. So they took out the casket and they opened it up. Here's this beautiful oriental cloth wrapped around relics. And in the relics, there's an inscription. The inscription read, "Here lies the body of St. Anne, the mother of the glorious Virgin Mary." The relics of St. Anne had been miraculously rediscovered. That's the relics of the mother of God. It's the relics of God's grandma. The woman in whose womb the Immaculate Conception had been immaculately conceived. St. Anne, whose feast day we celebrated this past Tuesday. So Charlemagne, with all those present, spent a long time on his knees in prayer and venerated the holy relics which had been so amazingly discovered. For 3 days, the people of Apt, who were struck by the great mercy that God had shown them and these miracles, kept a reverential silence, which to me in itself is as great a miracle as the rest, if you can imagine a town being very quiet and only speaking when necessary and then only in whispers. Charlemagne had an exact narrative of these events drawn up by one of his notaries and a copy sent to Pope St. Leo III with the royal seal. And this letter and the Pope's reply still exist. Okay, Father, but there's a part of the story missing here. It's just how did St. Anne's relics end up in southern France in the first place? After all, it's not exactly a hop, skip, and a jump from the Holy Land to the south of France. How did they end up there? They were shipped there. How did that happen? Well, that and also is an interesting story. We know it from tradition as well as divine liturgy. In fact, priests just read about this on Friday in their breviary. There's a brief version of the story in the Roman breviary, and it's also scattered throughout the Roman martyrology, and we know it from stories from sacred tradition. What happened was this. After Ascension of our Lord and St. Stephen's martyrdom, in about the year 47, during the persecutions of the Catholics by the Jews captured a whole group of Catholics, well-known prominent Catholics, and stuffed them into a boat without sails or oars or rudder and pushed it out to sea, intending, of course, that everyone on board would die. But instead, this crippled death boat miraculously landed with everybody safe and healthy all the way on the other end of the Mediterranean Sea in the south of France. Everybody climbs out healthy and safe. On board, they had the relics of St. Anne. So that's how St. Anne got to southern France. And as you can easily imagine, the arrival of a sailless, rudderless, oarless boat from the far stretches of the ocean with a cargo of healthy people on board made quite an impression on the local population of pagans. As the breviary for July 29th states, quote, "By means of this miracle and the preaching of the Catholics, the people of Marseille and the surrounding regions were converted to Christ." Close quote. So besides the relics of St. Anne, who else was on the ship? Well, on the death boat was St. Maximinus. He's one of the 72 disciples of our Lord. Remember, after our Lord chose the 12 apostles, then he chose the 72 disciples and he sent them before him 2 by 2. Anyway, St. Maximinus was a bishop and one of the 72 disciples, and he was stuffed on a boat. He wound up being the first bishop of what's now France. Along with him was St. Sidonius, who is the man born blind from birth. We read about him in St. John's Gospel in chapter 9. It's our Lord, where our Lord does a miracle very much like the miracle he did today in St. Mark's Gospel. He gives him sight by making mud with spit and lining his eyes with it, okay? And then remember, he's reporting to the priest, and they're saying, this man's a sinner. How could that happen? Okay, that's St. Sidonius. After the Ascension, St. Sidonius was baptized by the apostles, and he's the companion of St. Maximinus. St. Sidonius was a coadjutor bishop of St. Maximinus and wound up buried next to him in the south of France. Okay, who else is on that boat? Another saint whose feast we celebrated last week on the 22nd of July. A notorious sinner who had 7 devils driven out of her, who'd stayed at the foot of the cross during our Lord's passion and death, and who was the first public witness of our Lord's resurrection, St. Mary Magdalene. St. Peter had entrusted St. Mary Magdalene to St. Maximinus. He was supposed to take care of her. So she wound on board this death ship as well. The fathers state that after reaching southern France, Marseille and the surrounding whole province was converted from paganism by the force of St. Mary Magdalene's preaching. She spent the rest of her life as a contemplative. She lived for 30 years in a cave in the mountains, praying and doing penance. Like St. Catherine of Siena and St. Gemma Galgani, her only food was the most blessed sacrament, what the holy angels would bring to her every day. That's what she lived on. Just before she died, the holy angels brought her to St. Maximinus Chapel, because God takes care of his friends. And St. Maximinus gave her the last rites and buried her there. In the year 710, when the Saracens invaded, her relics were hidden away by the monks, and they remained hidden until the rediscovery of them in the 13th century. They're confirmed to be authentic relics of St. Mary Magdalene by Pope Boniface VIII. They'd taken part of her jawbone and sent it to the Lateran, and then after it came